This is Talkin' Mule Deer with your hosts Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. Talkin' Mule Deer takes you on a journey to learn more about the Mule Deer Foundation, mule deer and black-tailed deer biology and management, tips and tactics for hunting, conservation issues, and even features some of our corporate and celebrity partners. Now, let's start talking mule deer.
Hey, this is Jody Stemler. We are talking mule deer from the North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference.
And I'm Steve Belinda, and sitting down with us right now is Ed Arnett from the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and David Singer from the Colorado Wildlife Transportation Alliance. Welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
How's it going?
Good. So, as David, from your title, Wildlife Transportation Alliance, tell us a little bit about your organization, what you guys are trying to do.
I work for the Colorado Department of Transportation. We have an interest in reducing animal vehicle collisions. I also am an environmental specialist, and so we have an interest in the diversity and health of the herds as they migrate across the state of Colorado.
And so the alliance is something pretty new, right?
It's been about 2 or 3 years. We've had a couple of successes on specific projects throughout the state. And we want to figure out, how do we make this more consistent on a statewide basis? How can this be a programmatic success? It's something that we've seen that no one agency can do on its own. We need these strong partnerships in order to advance this collective mission.
So it's a true alliance. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Cool. So Ed, you're an old friend, colleague. We've known each other a long time. You and Jody and I go back. And tell us a little bit about the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, or TRCP is the acronym we're going to use, and what you're up to these days.
Sure. So the TRCP started with what I deem to be a great vision from our founder, Jim Range, who really saw the need to bring together the disparate voices of the sportsman's community. So the TRCP was formed under that true partnership umbrella, and bringing all the individual players together and trying to have a more collective voice to influence policy. So the TRCP is a sportsman's conservation organization. We've been around since 2002. Work a lot on public land policy, some level of state policy as it transcends a broader view of the world as it relates to federal policy and other things like migration corridor work, those kinds of things. So we'll engage at state level, but it's largely we work on federal policy. We also have programs on coastal fisheries and other things.
David, just a disclaimer, Jody and I have both worked for TRCP in the past, so there's
as a consultant, we're not staffed. You were staff.
I was
not staff.
I was actually staff and consultant.
But I remember the day of the mental conception by Jim, and the idea was
it immaculate?
We were working on wildlife conservation funding on the federal level. At that time, it was the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, trying to get dedicated funding for conservation and recreation. It was an incredible program. It was relatively revolutionary. We had passed the House, and we got undermined along the way, and Jim was pissed that the sportsman's community, the moderate conservation voice, did not have the relevancy in this debate, that we were sidelined by, on one side, either the conservative property rights folks, and on the other side, a more left-leaning environmental core. And so TRCP was born in that concept of trying to mobilize a voice in that moderate sportsman conservation vision.
And it's certainly what intrigued me, not just our mission, which is guaranteeing all Americans quality places to hunt and fish, but that vision was very intriguing to me when I was coming to the organization. And it has its challenges. I mean, the Mule Deer Foundation has been a long-standing partner of ours, and we've appreciated that partnership, along with all of our partners. We're up to 58 partners in the organization now. But that collective voice is what's key, as you all know.
Now, Ed, you have a long history in a lot of things. You've done bighorn sheep work. You worked in the bat world, or one of the foremost.
He works in the bat cave.
He's the Batman. But now you guys are working on some stuff that transcends to everyone out there. It's that wildlife highways corridor nexus stuff. Tell us, Ed, what I know you recently held an event. You're working to get some stuff out there. You're working with David and the Alliance. Tell us, get into this, guys. Tell
Sure.
our listeners really what's going on.
Yeah, and I'll start a little bit bigger picture. Of course, some of our work on public lands policy relates to energy development. It relates to the new the secretarial order and migration corridor. There's a lot of things embedded in habitat and public land conservation. The transportation piece was born from Secretarial Order 3362, from our work on it. So when Secretarial Order 3362 was released and the states issued all of their priorities, all 11 states that are encompassed by the Secretarial Order submitted threats, and all 11 states submitted transportation issues as a major threat. So we were contacted.
So let me stop you there. That's basically animals getting killed on the road and causing damage, safety, and affecting how the ecology of the animals.
So I'd imagine it was the vehicle collisions, but it's also them severing corridors, right? I mean,
Correct.
We've seen maps. Matt Kaufman, we had the Wyoming Migration Initiative came on, and there are maps on their website that show the stop of corridors.
Correct.
At I-80, and it severs. It has the potential to sever these traditional corridors.
That's a really key point because, these are linear features that are very pervasive in the landscape. There can be habitat fragmentation issues, but also that barrier effect of movements as well as the collisions.
Well, I was going to say from our world of wildlife conservation and caring about the critters, it is the severing of the corridors. But from a human health perspective, it's the safety issue.
Absolutely. And so this is emerged to be a win-win. From a transportation perspective, we have a safety interest, human safety, and reducing those crashes. There's a real cost to every time an animal is hit. It's to the animal, to our economy, to an individual, whether it's the vehicle or an injury themselves. And so that's something.
And premiums. Let's
Insurance
not forget about that.
Yeah.
And Flo, if you're listening, let's get those.
This is a real Big Ten issue. And so whether it's for recreational, whether it's ecological, whether it's transportation or safety perspective, it advances a lot of different interests. And so that's where the alliance was kind of born out of, like, we've got, depending on whatever your value is, getting animals across the road
Safely
advances that value.
Exactly.
Well, I think everyone in Colorado would agree with that as they go down, whether it's a 2-track rural road or Interstate 70 or 25, they don't want to have to worry about injuring themselves or harming the species and taking an animal out of the population.
Everybody has a story of either a hit or a near miss, whether you're living on the Front Range in urban areas and you're recreating out in the mountainous areas, or if you live out in those areas too, just kind of your day-to-day trip.
Well,
so you guys have been bringing folks together on this stuff. I'm sorry, Ed, for cutting you off.
No, that's all right.
I know Colorado did a roadway summit, and Ed, you and I have been part of some stuff in Wyoming and Montana. How did the folks outside of the transportation world or the wildlife work, are they buying into this?
Well, I think so, and I'll let David speak to from his perspective. I mean, back to the event, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
3 states had wildlife transportation summits in the past: Wyoming, Colorado, and then Montana, in that order. And when the secretarial order came out and the desire to have a coalescence of the states to come together and talk about this, that was kind of the genesis of why we had this transportation workshop. And we brought together 12 state DOTs, 11 wildlife agencies, multiple NGOs and federal agencies to get together and talk about this. And you can imagine that there are some states that aren't talking about it at all or don't want to talk about it, all the way to those that are being very progressive and very proactive about this. And I would certainly put Colorado in that upper end of progression in dealing with these issues. So I think this is not a new issue. Wildlife vehicle collisions and road ecology have been around a long time. Montana State University has its own institute on the Western Transportation Institute. So people have been looking at this a long time. But in discussing this with our community, you realize pretty quickly that we're still not getting things done in all the right places, particularly for big game.
And what you're talking about there, Ed, is passages, correct?
Correct.
I mean, I've been part
Crossings.
of some of the stuff in Wyoming. But we're talking about explain a little bit what goes into that. I know the cost is huge, but David, from the planning perspective, it's got to be a long process. And if you get in at the wrong time, you may not have a chance.
It is a long range planning process that we do here in transportation. We look at the needs today, but we're also looking 20, 30 years down the road and seeing how is our population growing? Where are they going to be growing? And we overlay that with what we know about the herds. What are their behaviors? Are they going to be traveling down the same areas and the same ranges in 20 years? And so we're trying to use models to make data-driven decisions on prioritizing where those hot spots are today and where they're going to be down the road so that we can make data-driven investments.
And Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't Utah have an app that they use? They go out and map the roadkill so that they can help figure this stuff out?
They do. It was a very creative application of using a smartphone to record information on fatalities. That was developed by Daniel Olson with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And actually that was an interesting finding from our workshop, where we need to start developing these technologies and integrating data sets on how we can define hotspots and where the collisions occur and where it makes the most sense to put these overpasses or underpasses.
Otherwise, how are we finding out that information?
Well, it comes through vehicle crash data that the Department of Transportation agencies have. That's a key thing. But we're also, I think you can make the connection of those crossings with GPS collar data. I mean, they don't all just stop at a highway, and you can imagine rural highways and rural county roads are very different than interstate highways, where they're darn sure going across all the time. So that data can help identify these migration corridors.
So we have folks putting GPS collars or other type of radio collars, and that information then is transmitted back to a server somewhere, and you pull it up and you crunch it, and you basically can say, hey, they're crossing right here.
A lot, yeah, and refine that. And then the next step, though, is working with your Department of Transportation to coalesce these pieces of information and determine where those hot spots are and where it makes the best sense to put a crossing.
So, I talked about this the other day in the special session, and Ed, you and I have talked about this a lot. Trappers Point up in Pinedale is one of those areas that had we done it better from the beginning, we wouldn't have had to come in and retrofit that crossing and that bottleneck, which is 6,000 antelope and 8,000 to 10,000 deer a year. It was a bottleneck that was known about. They had a small crossing that no animal used, so they would get on the highway. DOT came in the 90s, early 2000s, upgraded the highway, put a passing lane, jacked the speed limit up. Well, guess what happened? We started seeing more and more. They tried the electronic signs. Those didn't work in Wyoming winters. Yeah. Plus, so what they had to come back in, and it took about 5 years to get the money, is they basically, that whole corridor from Pinedale to 40-rod country out there, 15 miles, they had to come in and put a couple overpasses, underpasses, and fencing, and it ended up costing a lot more than it would have. So explain how this needs to work so that we don't repeat that mistake, guys.
Planning happens at a local level, and I think we work at the county and municipal levels to say, what is your vision in the next 20 years? And they see where those needs are, where the animals are really in conflict with the traveling public. And so by those counties identifying, or municipal planning organizations identifying those hotspots, identifying those areas, it sets on their list of priority transportation projects. And then from that, money can flow, saying this is where we want to invest in the next 20 years.
Well, and I think that's a really important observation, and it is an issue of not just the transportation planning, but housing developments and other things. Mule Deer Foundation chapters have presence in a lot of these communities. They know where those animals are crossing. They know. So getting involved in the municipal planning process is probably a great opportunity for chapters or individual members to get involved and get engaged so that they can help be on the front end of these planning processes.
That's a great point, because one of the things we heard, the two key takeaways that I heard anyway, was that biologists are often far too late, and they need to coordinate early and often. And the other thing had to do with partnerships and stakeholder engagement. And you need to engage the breadth of the stakeholder community. Obviously, local Mule Deer Foundation chapters are part of that sporting community that need to be engaged. And we would obviously think that most stakeholders would agree with this, but one key thing that someone said was don't assume that the public and all stakeholders are going to consider this to be a good idea.
We're seeing that in Idaho right now.
Exactly. So I think that early coordination with the diversity of players is really, really critical.
So Ed, you talked about the PDFs of this. Explain what you mean by that.
So, and I'll give our colleague, research biologist Jeff Gagnon at the Arizona Game and Fish Department credit for this, of course. He calls it the PDFs, placement, design, and fencing. And it centers on the fact that you need to know, this is back to the old metaphor of real estate, location, location, location. Data-driven approaches to determine where those specific locations are for placement. The design has to not only consider engineering considerations for structural durability and longevity and all the things that you engineers think about, David, but also about animal behaviors, dimensions and line of sight, and just things that make animals comfortable to use the structures in the first place. And
So,
then the fencing.
let me stop you right there, Ed. Why wouldn't an animal just use a bridge? I mean, what do they do? Is it a width? Is it a? I mean, I know I've been to Banff, and up there they actually plant trees and shrubs and all sort of stuff.
They make it more of a natural infrastructure type develop. Not they, but I mean, some of these structures have tried very hard to make these crossings as natural as possible, particularly for large carnivores that may be a little more sensitive than an
So
elk
the bears,
crossing.
the wolves, the cats,
Exactly.
sort of thing.
And an undercrossing, an underpass, as you might imagine, if you can't see to the end of it, you don't know what's on the other end. And there may be a bear waiting for you, Jeff.
Or a
Gagnon,
killer clown.
Or or a hunter.
Yeah.
We all are afraid of tunnels.
Exactly. Accounting for that, the animal behavior and how they respond to going through.
So actually
these
knowing the
overpasses,
biology,
underpasses.
of the target species.
Yep. And it's
Hey,
and
we
there's
went
multiple,
to school for
and it's multiple
So-
objectives too. It's not just ungulates. It's considering
Absolutely.
large carnivores, small animals. The objective can transcend all different species.
And the third factor of the
Was
PDF,
fencing. The key thing is if you can't funnel the animals into using the crossing, they may never find it or use it. So this is a means by which, the right amount of fencing, you don't have to fence necessarily 30 miles, but sometimes it can extend that far to bring those animals into a bottleneck. But it's a safe bottleneck because now they can go up and over or under the threat, which is being hit on the road.
So we have some of these out there in a couple states. Are they working?
Yeah, they are. And so what we're doing is not only committing to build these, but we're also monitoring their effectiveness. And so with each new example, we're learning more and more on width ratio or fencing and what types of individual design refinements optimize this network, this system of improvements.
I live here in Colorado, and I drive up through Kremling a lot to hunt in northwest Colorado.
So you've been over-
and that
over
is
9.
the Highway 24, right? Is
Nine.
that
Highway
Highway 9?
9.
I'm sorry, Highway 9 through Kremling.
Don't take directions from Jody.
Actually, that's not true. I am very good. I just don't necessarily know the road numbers. Know exactly how to get there, though.
I knew you were going north, to Kremling.
But the crossings that they have there, that was a huge project over the last few years. And I know I've seen footage of moose crossing. And I understand we've talked to some of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I think it was a 90% reduction.
That's correct. Yeah. And so that's been a real achievement, accomplishment that we're real proud of here in Colorado. I think it really reduced the animal vehicle collisions in the first year. And it's something that was a partnership with the local agencies, with landowners, with state and federal agencies, and they went out and they did an education campaign, and they talked with communities and said, this is important. How do we raise awareness? How do we fundraise? And we realized that it wasn't any one entity that was going to have to pay for this. We needed to pass the hat. And so everybody stood up and collectively did that. Now back to the learned behavior, that was built in phases. And for the first phase, they built that out. They learned a lot from how effective, what worked, what didn't, and they applied all those things into the second phase. And so it really optimized that whole network. And so it's really been an effective example.
Actually learning by doing. What a great concept.
Hey, that's 4-H.
So we actually highlighted this particular project a lot during our workshop, and largely because of that partnership framework. And it was a private landowner that really put forward a lot of the seed money some $4 million were put toward that project, and then it generated that cascading leveraging effect to deal with a $40 million
and that private
project.
landowner is Paul Tudor Jones, who am I right? I mean, who is very engaged in the conservation community. He's been a part of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for a long time. He's a tremendous conservation leader. So it's not surprising that he would invest in something like this. He has a ranch in the area, so he's seeing it personally. But other large landowners or other businessmen are seeing these connections of wildlife conservation and helping out and supporting the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, the State Department of Transportation, and others. And I think that's a great thing.
Well, what I love about it is we do these for big game mostly. The charismatic, larger species that need, that end up on the windshield or are, take so long. We lose a bear, we lose a wolf, we lose a cat. You don't replace that animal very quickly into the population. But the benefits to all other wildlife and species then come in. You go to these things, you're going to see small mammals, you're going to see birds. In Pinedale, we actually have sage grouse using underpasses. Now, think about that. A bird that can fly over a highway
is walking
underneath an underpass put in for pronghorn antelope and mule deer. It's awesome. You set up cameras, and, it's applicable elsewhere. Florida with some of the issues down there.
Yeah, with Florida panthers.
Herp crossings, turtles.
I dealt with that in
lizards.
Eugene, Oregon when I lived there. People were dealing with that.
That session, there was somebody who gave on turtles and
Western pond turtles and others.
Frogs, toads.
Well, I know a couple of crossings for box turtles and some eastern skinks and that I used to go out and park my car sideways in the road so that when people came up, we could get the animals off the road and then let the car through, because if not, you were just going to have a mat of dead animals there. And so it's really exciting to see this now. Ed, I'm going to try to stump you here. And I can't remember if we've
Stump
ever...
the chump!
Dump the jump.
Are we seeing demographic impacts from saving all these animals from not getting hit on the highway? Are they available out there for the population, for harvest, for other things?
Yeah, I don't have the data in front of me, but let's just think about this as biologists. Where would you see a population level impact? If you're talking a large mule deer herd, you may not necessarily see that as a limiting factor, even if it's killing a fairly significant
That's
proportion.
the compensatory versus additive mortality that we
Sure,
learned.
and then
Ecologist hats, take it off.
10% mortality of a given deer herd may not really be a population level effect. But think about this. Think about a small isolated population of bighorn sheep where you're hitting 10 or 15% of that population a year. Now, they're capable of coming back, but there may be other limiting factors, more so than maybe grizzly bears or something. But,
well, and from the hunter perspective, we look at it as that's an animal that's taken out of the opportunity pool for us.
It's taken out of the opportunity pool.
What I've learned through all this is you have to convince folks to support this, and if you say if that deer is not whacked on the road, it's going to be out there in the environment for you to maybe go after or to have babies and grow the herd. And that is something that the hunter, regardless of their background or the lay person, is going to say, that makes a lot of sense, whether it's statistically happening or not.
Well, and collisions are indiscriminate. The vehicles are not taking out the old and the sick in a compensatory way. They're indiscriminate. And so whatever's in the road at the time the vehicle goes through and hits it is going to get hit. But I think there can be population level impacts. Clearly for Florida panthers, clearly for isolated populations of bighorn sheep or even moose, other creatures. But still, that's the right way to think about it, in my opinion. If you've got a solution to this to reduce those fatalities, why wouldn't you do it? And to me, this is pretty low-hanging fruit. It's a win-win. It's just really expensive low-hanging fruit. It's like buying your apple. It's like buying your apples at Whole Foods.
Yeah,
it's low-hanging fruit, but it's expensive.
Well, yes.
Disclaimer: none of us don't want you to shop at Whole Foods.
That's correct. Sorry.
My point is the individual car collision, it's pretty pertinent to that person who either totals a car or is injured in that kind of a crash as well. So, again, compensatory versus whatever. I mean, any population level for that human impacts as well may not be there. But when that individual is dealing with a crash, or we have multitudes of individuals or cars, or the insurance premiums are going up.
And to that end, when you roll this up and put all of the information together, if you think about this, and this is just some information that came through at the workshop that we had, Animal strikes account for about 10% of the insurance claims and about 25% of the money paid out on comprehensive coverage plans. That's what
Wow.
kicks in when
Say that
you
again.
hit a deer. About 10% of the comprehensive claims and 25% of the money paid out.
That's significant.
Nationwide.
Well, let me tell you how significant it is. The Highway Loss Data Institute shared some numbers with us, and between 2014 and 2017, I can't remember the actual numbers, but there's an average cost per strike of about $3,000. When I did my basic back-of-the-napkin math, that's $5.4 billion. Wow,
that's
in
real money.
comprehensive claims paid out. That's just the insurance over a 4-year period. Just over a 4-year period. That's just the insurance industry's part of this. David, there are clearly costs to your organization as well as your Department of Transportation's as well as state wildlife agencies just to deal with this.
Yeah, even looking in Colorado, when you look at rural areas, that's the number one cause of safety and accidents. I want to say it's over 37% of Colorado rural accidents are related to vehicle collisions.
Isn't that why the white-tailed deer is the most deadly animal in America? Because it causes more human deaths through...
They make up the largest. Deer contribute the highest percentage, obviously, and mostly in a lot of whitetail.
Now, Ed, from the other thing that we learned from your workshop summary is when are most animals hit?
November. Consistently. Consistently across the country. It may be a different magnitude, but the timing is at its lowest in August and highest in November.
Is that because...
Rut and dispersal.
Rut dispersal.
But
But also think about, in many states, that's the first month where you experience any winter driving with the low light conditions and everything else. So
you could also
There's a lot of
attribute
factors, yeah.
increased movement from hunters moving
pushing animals
around. There's
around,
probably
yeah.
lots of causal factors of that. But I found that data to be very fascinating.
Yeah.
It was very, biologists, we all look at patterns. That's a key thing we look for. And there wasn't a lot of variation in that graph that was presented. It is consistently November, no matter where you're at. It's just a higher magnitude in a state like
Yeah, I was going to say,
South Dakota
that's not
or
saying it's
Wyoming.
not happening other times. That's
right.
just the highest.
That's
Yeah.
the peak.
So these things are expensive. The coordination, the planning, the data collection, that's all one chunk. Actually getting money for structures and getting coordination between transportation departments at the state level and the state agencies has got to be hard. What's going on at the federal level? Ed, is there any coordination amongst Department of Transportation at the federal level and, say, Interior with this order?
Yeah, I know that with the issuance of Secretarial Order 3362 and the identification of threats, that Department of Interior has been in conversation with Department of Transportation. And Federal Highways was part of our workshop. And we had discussions about policy and funding sources and those kinds of things. So there are those high-level conversations ongoing. We have a transportation bill that's coming up soon in 2020. Yep. Currently, there's language in that in the various portions of those bills and various grant programs for money to be available. So we want to make sure that stays there and maybe even strengthen that a little bit to ensure that wildlife vehicle collisions are considered. And there's some performance measures associated with that. So there's implementation. Because we said this earlier, some states aren't interested. They're not doing much between the wildlife and agency and the Departments of Transportation. Others are on top of this and moving forward.
And here's the
working on
cool
priorities.
thing about the TRCP full circle, maybe not full circle yet, but getting there. Back in the day, Jim Range in the early phases of TRCP worked on the highways bill for something called transportation enhancements and other things through what was ICE-T, the Interstate Transportation Enhancement Act, which was funding dedicated for wildlife. It was not nearly as effective and certainly not in this direction because of the way the language was created, the way the pots. It's gone off to a whole bunch of different other areas and not dealing with an issue of this nature. I think the opportunity for policy that is far more prescriptive and recognizing these impacts through the highway bill is in sight. And again, the fact that TRCP is leading the charge on this, to me, is very cool. To see that history and the connection to something that went on 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and now coming back in, and hopefully we can make something out of it this time.
And that prescriptive idea certainly isn't new. I think people have tried, most certainly, to to look at a wildlife-specific program, and there's some consequences to that and some pushback. What we really need is to make sure that the policy allows for that durable, long-term use of those funds for wildlife projects that transcend any administration, any
Across state
engineer,
lines.
across state lines, all of those kinds of things. That's
Yep.
the ultimate goal.
Yep.
Whether it has to be a specific line item is yet to be determined, but we want to make sure that it just doesn't wind up as a nice to have and fall down the priority list. That's the key.
Yeah. So I know there was a I've seen a video that I think you guys played at I was not able to be at that summit, but about a project in Washington State on the I-90
Yep.
corridor. It's about a 20 to 30 minute video, but it's fantastic, and it gives you a really great overview about how those partnerships work together to create that.
And biologists.
And biologists,
engineers
and then
working
also
together.
seeing what the design to me is so innovative, and the things that they're doing in that particular project are amazing. Just getting underway, some of them are going to be completed in this year, and then a bunch more going down the line. But if anybody's interested, that video is a phenomenal one to do. I know we covered it in the Wildlife Management Institute's Outdoor News Bulletin in the last month when Chris Smith wrote, who was at that meeting.
Yes.
He wrote a story about it, so we do have a link there. I don't know if you have one. And
We do, and we have one for Highway 9 as well.
Yeah.
There's a nice 5-minute video. If you're time constrained, you can watch the 5-minute video in Colorado. Similar in concept.
It's an exciting time to be thinking and be involved with this topic because we are seeing successes throughout the West. And so from Colorado, I can go and look at Washington, see what they're doing, or what Idaho's doing, what Wyoming's doing, and bring those successes, and we try to duplicate that in our own home state.
Yep.
Now, David, about a decade ago, we talked about getting a crossing of Vail Pass on I-70. There was actually a contest with design select. Is that still in the works? I mean, is that still an issue from Animal Crossing? I know the traffic's probably actually worse now than it was 10 years ago. But
particularly with avalanches.
It's true. People continue to keep moving to the west. The populations are getting larger and larger, and they're still going to continue to recreate in Summit County and Eagle County along the I-70 corridor, which is a substantial barrier.
Right.
And so what Colorado has done, and specifically the I-70 mountain corridor, is committed to think about wildlife mobility as a part of every project. They've integrated that so that it's not just building projects for safety, for mobility, but you're looking at these other values as a part of it and looking holistically at the project. So they are, as we do improvements, we coordinate with the biologists. We coordinate with the local communities.
So you actually have it in the culture now.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really key point, is getting that embedded in the culture.
Culture leads to business. Business leads to action. Action leads to things happening on
Results.
the ground and animals not getting
And you
splattered.
mentioned the contest. I think this is a really interesting point, and Nevada's done some creative work. Colorado has as well, by getting community engagement, students involved with, a contest for an educational sign or something to that effect. That community engagement is really a neat part of this and gives them skin in the game. The other key thing that I learned at this, kind of coming back to working with the Departments of Transportation, is getting the maintenance folks involved, getting those that are moving dirt, that are making this thing. It's not just having the executive director of your Department of Transportation and a great engineer like David or others involved with this. It goes all the way down to people moving dirt, and it gives them skin in the game, and they want it to succeed, and they can drive by it and tell their families and friends, hey, I moved the dirt on this project, and it was really important to me. And I've learned that over my career working with folks.
My grandfather
Go
built
all the
bridges in Pennsylvania, and every time we go over one that he was on, I built
Grandpa's
this.
bridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he'll tell that story, and then that just it just moves
So
through the
the other
community.
thing is I think we all enjoy seeing live animals versus dead animals, and being able to drive by and pointing at that moose and saying, look at the moose. Going over the overpass is better.
Look at the moose!
Quick, get out of the
or,
way.
or look at that moose that didn't make it. 'Cause it's
Yep.
on the side of the road. So, gentlemen, what's next? David, what's up? What's in 2019 hold for you? And Ed, same question.
Colorado, we are launching a wildlife prioritization study where we've looked at data. We've built a model to say where are our hotspots? Where do we need to prioritize our 5-10% segments of roadway or specific dots on the map? And from that, we can start tailoring local strategies to program these to create awareness, to create partnerships, to make these ideas a reality.
I hope Highway 13 makes that.
It's on the list.
Where can they find information about what CDOT's doing or the Transportation Alliance? Is there a website?
We'll be launching a website in the coming months, Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance.com. And
All
so-
spelled out, A-N-D, Wildlife.
Correct.
Colorado Wildlife.
And that might be a one-stop shop.
I hope your domain for your email isn't that long.
No, I think it's something where, yes, you can go to CDOT's website or the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but I thought that this is something collectively, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Mule Deer Foundation are partners on this, and so we're trying to
Yep,
collectively
Marty
all-
Holmes is involved with that.
That's
isn't he?
right.
Yep.
That's right. So this is
Absolutely.
a campaign where we're trying to talk about how you can get involved, how you can learn more, what are the current events, what are the initiatives, how you can stay engaged.
Awesome. Is there any event coming up that the public can get involved in?
No, I don't know. I think
Well,
you know,
just
there's-
if they are, they'll find
Yep.
it on the
Yep.
website.
Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance.com. Excellent. Okay, and Ed, what else have you got? What is TRCP going to be working on? And do you have a website coming out from this workshop?
We will. And so 3 things specific to the transportation workshop that was held in Salt Lake City. We're finalizing our proceedings. We're doing partner outreach, which this is certainly part of. We're working with the participants on some recommendations for future events and how we want to proceed with getting people together broadly across the West. And then I think we need to sit down and strategize with our partners as to kind of what we want to do. And when I say that, I mean the sporting community, our conservation partners and others from a policy perspective. We've got the 2020 transportation bill, all of those kinds of things. And then we want to get it down to the ground and start working and getting the sporting community. They've been involved, but we want to keep them involved with the momentum that's behind this at a local scale. So that's local MDF chapters. That's a variety of different sporting groups working on those individual projects or at a state level. And all of our stuff will be posted on this website that will be forthcoming on post-transportation workshop that we had soon, probably within a couple of weeks. I don't have a domain yet.
Well, but I'm sure
but
they can
we'll
get there
have it
through
available.
trcp.org,
Correct.
right? Yeah,
There
I'm
will
sure
be
they-
a link through that.
Yep.
So.
And we've had a number of stories about wildlife crossings from our regional directors and some of our writers in the MDF magazine. So this is an issue we've covered for a long time and are very aware of and involved in. So we appreciate the time that we've had with you guys here today. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for helping make our roadways safer and helping sustain our wildlife population. So for now, thank you for talking mule deer. This is Jody Stemler.
And I'm Steve Belinda. Thank you, gentlemen, for keeping the legacy alive at your organizations and for what you're doing for conservation. And thank you for talking mule deer.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking mule deer with Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. The Mule Deer Foundation is the only conservation group in North America dedicated to restoring, improving, and protecting mule deer and black-tailed deer and their habitat. MDF is a strong voice for hunters in access, wildlife management, and conservation policy issues. To find out more, visit www.muledeer.org and stay tuned for the next episode of Talkin' Mule Deer.